Today's daf we're going to learn is Megillah, Daf Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Joel Silberstein in loving memory of Mazal Tov Bat Shalom. Okay, before we start, I just want to mention that our Circle of Friends 2022 campaign has begun. And thank you everyone so far for joining the Circle of Friends. This is a good way for us to ensure that our activities can continue, our teaching, all the different programs. So if you're enjoying, right, it's basically in dollars, it's $380 a year, which is about $1 a day. So if you're enjoying the Shiurim, you're part of any of the learning, please consider joining our Circle of Friends. Any donations of all forms are invited, are welcome. Okay, we are going to get started with our daf. We're going to get on a big tangent, which is classic for the Gemara. Maybe we'll try to connect the tangent eventually back to what we're learning in our Masechet. But right now, it's a classic tangent. We ended the daf yesterday with, if we saw that Rabbi Yirmiyah, or possibly Rabbi Shiur bar Abba, was explaining something that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi had said. Yehoshua ben Levi had said that when we talk about a krach, which is a walled city, that reads the Megillah on a different day. So what happens? It means, what is a krach? It's not just the walled city, but it's even a city that's close by or that can see the city, okay? Samach or near it, okay? And that actually, I just want to remind you this because it's going to come up later in the daf. That was darshan from, it was learned out from the words. It was a drasha on Medina Medina. Then not just because, why does it say a double language? Every single state, which that's the way you would translate it. But in Hebrew, it's Medina Medina, which actually shows you the difficulty of translating. When you say Medina Medina, you don't say state and state. You say, right, every single state. But if you don't translate it, and I'm particularly telling you this because we're going to get into translations of the Torah and the problematic nature of it. If you don't translate it, it says Medina Medina, state and state. That's literally. And they say, so what does it mean state and state? It means the city and even things that are close to the city. It comes to include additional things in what's treated as a walled city for the laws that we saw yesterday. And then Rabbi Yirmiyah, or maybe it was Rabbi Shiur bar Abba, we're not sure, it was the statement made by one of the two of them, said, which happens often in the Gemara where we don't know exactly who said something. We say, oh, he said it, or maybe he said it. So he explains, well, what's that? What's samuch? How close is close? From Hamatan to Tveria, which is a meal. Now the Gemara wants to bring a whole slew of statements, 3, that were also brought in the name of either Rabbi Yirmiyah or Rabbi Shiur bar Abba. So here goes. 3 lines from the bottom of Bet Amud Bet. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah v'itema Rabbi Shiur bar Abba, man sepach tzofim amarun. Man sepach are the letters from the end of the words. And when you have a mem or a tzadi or all these letters at the end of a word, it's called a mem sofit, a nun sofit. It's got a different way of looking. It doesn't look the same way. There's 5 letters like that. Man sepach is the acronym for it. V'tizbera, is that really true? So Sofim Amarun means the Nevi'im, the prophets, were the ones who established this. So the Gemara says, really? The prophets? How could that be? V'haktiv, the very last pasuk in Vayikra says, Ve'ela ha-mitzvot. These are the mitzvot, the commandments that you received at Har Sinai. What's the drasha on this? She'ein navi rashai l'chadesh davar me'ata. These are the mitzvot, you can't add anything on. Now, this isn't exactly a mitzvah, but the point is that Nevi'im are not the types, the prophets are not people who could start making up new things. They don't have that ability. Okay, they have communication with God and they say what God says, but they don't make up things like, oh, let's take this letter mem and let's decide that when it's at the end of a word, it's going to look different. They don't do that kind of thing. Ve'od. And additionally, we have another problem. Ha'amar Rav Chisda, a very famous drasha, mem v'samach shebeluchot b'nei sayomdim. What were the luchot? They were tablets, and the letters were engraved. Now, engraved means they were fully cut out. So you have this tablet with, anochi. So the aleph is engraved and cut out. You could kind of see through to the other side. But what happens with the letter samach, okay, and the letter mem, which are basically a circle, right? The samach is a circle. The mem is not exactly a circle. It also depends exactly whatever, but a little more of a square. Reminded me of the circle that we ended Ta'anit with about these circles. These circles, b'nes hayomdim, meaning it was a closed letter. Because it's closed, what happens? If you engrave it, right, the circle in the middle, or this whatever's in the middle, will fall, right? It won't be there. And then you'll just have a big hole in the luchot. So it was a miracle that those pieces that weren't attached stayed in place anyway. That was the miracle. So now if that's the case, That was way back when the tablets were given, which means clearly the Nevi'im, the prophets, were not the ones who came up with this idea. Again, assuming that midrash is a historical midrash, right? Which, that's a whole question in of itself. We won't deal with that right now. So the Gemara says, right, and then, as Gita's pointing out, which I'm not going to get into, but there's Ktav Shuli, there's different scripts that existed, right? Which script they were written in. Anyway, we're going to not deal with that for right now. So the Gemara answers, in Midahavu Havu, V'lo Avayad, yes, they existed. Mansapaf existed for sure, but what was it? What did the Nevi'im do? Lo Avayad, he be'emtza teva, he be'sof teva. They knew there were two versions of the mem. I'll just use the mem as an example because it's the first one. There were two versions, a regular mem and a mem sofit, the end mem. And it wasn't clear which is supposed to be in the beginning of a word and which is supposed to go at the end of a word. So what did the Nevi'im do? They established which goes in the middle of a word, or beginning, obviously, and which goes at the end of a word. And they established right? The closed ones at the end, the open ones at the beginning, even though it's not so true for all of them, but we'll leave that aside. But they determine which ones. So the Gemara still has a further question. Sof. But still they can't make up things. They're not allowed to create anything new. So by them establishing which goes in the middle, which goes at the end, is also something new. So Ela shachachum v'chazru v'yistum. What did they do? Originally, it was clear which goes at the beginning, which goes at the end. What happened? People forgot over generations. Now, you might say, how could you forget something like this? It was a little bit strange. But remember, they didn't write as much as we do, right? They didn't write so much at all. So maybe that's why. And it basically became forgotten. And what did the Nevi'im do? They came and reestablished something that was forgotten. So they didn't do anything new. Definitely not that for sure. They're not allowed. But they reestablished what was established before. Okay, this sounds a lot like Kimu v'kiblu hayudim, right? That the Jews, remember that a lot of people connect this drashav, Kimu v'kiblu, the pasuk of Kimu v'kiblu hayudim, accepted upon themselves the days of Purim, but they connected to Naaseh v'nishma in the Torah. That in the Torah, they accepted this famous midrash that kafaleim har kigigit, that God kind of hung the mountain over them and they were forced into the Torah. And at Purim, they took it willingly. And that what Purim was, and I think all of these sugyot are going to somehow, or at least the first two things that were said in Rabbi Yirmiyah's name, maybe Rabbi Chiya connect to the concept of Purim and the time period and the things that were going on, and that there was this idea of a reestablishing something that was already there. Also, those who say Megillah Esther, where do you see a reference to it in the Torah, even though it wasn't really a Torah? We're dealing with a holiday that is a later thing. It's not mentioned in the Torah at all. It's the same kind of idea. Where do we come about making up a holiday? And if you learn Masechet Ta'anit, you know that there was this book Megillah Ta'anit, which all these days, like Purim, where miracles happen and all that. But then they canceled Megillah Ta'anit. And most of them were days that people celebrated in some way, at least by not doing, you can't make fasts and you can't eulogize people. But there's this idea that most of that got canceled in the end, but yet Purim and Hanukkah lasted. And maybe this is trying to establish, why should we believe these people who who established Purim? And what they're trying to say is this almost has connection to previous generations. And it's nothing really totally new, but there's some kind of reestablishing of something here and trying to say what power the later, whether it's the Nevi'im or the ones who were right at the end of the stage of Nevi'im, right in Shivat Zion, there weren't too many Nevi'im anymore, but where do they have the koch to establish this? What kind of authority do they have? And maybe this is trying to say, yes, there were a lot of things that were done in this time period that were important, significant, etc., and this is one of them. So maybe it's kind of in a backhanded way talking about Purim. The second statement, and that's really the third, but I'm saying once we're getting off on our tangent, it's the second one on the tangent. Targum shel Torah unkelus hager hamaro. I told you we're going to talk about translations. Who translated the Torah into Aramaic? Unkelus the Ger. He was a convert. It's said that he was a student of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, which we're going to see right here. Amaro mipi Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. He did his translation based on what he learned from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, right, which is after the destruction of the temple. And he's the one who translated the Torah. So we'll go on a little more, then we'll go back. Targum shel Nevi'im, Yonatan ben Uziel Amaro mipi Chagai Zechariah Malachi. The Targum of the Nevi'im, we're talking here about translations into Aramaic. And what's interesting about these is that the Targum on the Torah Onkelos, this is what I wanted to say before, I just left my head for a minute. The translation on the Torah is what we call Shnayim Mikra ve'Echad Targum, that many people read through the Parsha twice and once with translation. Many people use Rashi nowadays because most people don't understand Aramaic well enough. And even if you've learned Gemara and you understand Aramaic, the Aramaic of Onkelos is a little bit different and not so easy to understand. But the real halacha was to read it with the Targum. And in fact, the Temanim, the Yemenites, read the Torah with the Targum. We actually saw it referenced also in the Gemara earlier about this. Somebody reading alongside, they read the Targum with the Torah. So that's the Targum Onkelos. Yonatan ben Uziel read from, he translated the Nevi'im, and he got it not from, this is from Chagai Zechariah Malachi, much earlier. When he did this, the whole ground of Eretz Yisrael shook, almost like there was an earthquake, and it moved 400 parsal on 400 parasangs on 400 parasangs. 400 is our classic story number where we want to say some huge number. Okay, it kind of, quaked. Yatzda bat kol va'amra, a heavenly voice came down and said, Mi hu zeh shegilas sarai lebnei adam, who revealed my secrets to people. Okay, this was a huge problem. Okay, that was translated. Why is it such a problem? Okay, we're going to have a few questions. Number one, why was it such a problem? Number two, why did this happen only when they translated the prophets and not when they translated the Torah? Okay, so we're going to have to deal with all that. What was Yonatan ben Uziel's reaction when the whole earth quaked and he realized that was a sign from heaven? Amad Yonatan ben Uziel aragla v'amar, ani hu shegiliti sarecha lefnei adam. I'm the one who did it. It almost sounds like the Yonah story where something happens, to the whole boat, and then they try to figure out who's the one who was responsible. So he comes forward and says, it was me. Okay, don't punish everybody. And galoi v'yadua lefanecha shelo lechvodi asiti v'lo lechvod beit Abba ela lechvodcha asiti. I didn't do it for myself, for my own respect. I didn't do it for my family's respect. I did it for your respect, for the respect of God. I wanted people to be able to understand the prophets. I was all doing it for the good. Shelo yerbu machlokot b'Yisrael, famous line, which comes up in a number of places. I didn't want there to be a lot of machlokot, a lot of different opinions, people translating things in different ways. I wanted it to be clear what the translation is. Now that's part of the problem because, the problem with translations, we know, if you're learning Gemara right now with a Schottenstein or a Koren, and this probably happens often, where I say something and you look in your commentary and that's not what it says. And the reason is because there's many different ways of reading every line. You can read it in one way, you can read it another way. And because of that, the minute you translate, you only see it in the way that it's translated. It almost prevents you from seeing other opinions. Now, Yonatan ben Uziel thought this was a good thing. He says, that's a good thing. That's a positive development to do something like that. But they said, no, it's not so positive, There's a good question, One of the things people say nowadays is that there's a huge amount of learning going on because everything's accessible, which is great, but it does a little bit prevent people from being able to freely understand things in their own ways. So there's always, it's almost, this sugya is talking about the dangers of translations. Okay, translations can often be a little bit difficult, a little bit problematic. So that's what they're saying. But now we still don't really understand why only the translation of the prophets was a problem and not the translations of the Navi. So now we say, so before we get even there, I'm sorry, I didn't even finish the whole story there. Now we have another thing we have to figure out, which is, according to this, what's our problem? We have a translation of Onkelos on the Torah. We have a translation of Yonatan ben Uziel on the Nevi'im, but we don't have a translation of the Ketuvim. So if we don't have a translation of the Ketuvim, what's the problem? The problem is, why don't we have a translation of the Ketuvim? So the story continues. V'od bikesh legalot targum shel Ketuvim. They also wanted, Yonatan ben Uziel wanted to translate the Ketuvim also. Yatzda bat kol va'amra lo dayeka. They said, stop here. Okay, bad enough you translate the Nevi'im, definitely don't go on to translate the Ketuvim. So now they say, my time, why are the Ketuvim so bad that you really can't translate them? Di'it beiketz Mashiach. What's the issue? In Sefer Daniel, there are allusions to when the Mashiach is going to come. And they were worried that if Yonatan ben Uziel translated it, he would give away the secret, which was meant to be kept as a secret. okay? And therefore, we don't want that to happen. So first question is, before we even get to the basic question of what's the difference Navi and Nevi'im and Ketuvim and Torah, so Targum Shel Torah, Onkelos Hager Amaro, did Onkelos really translate this? V'ha Amar Rav Ika bar Avin, Amar Rav Chanan el Amarav. Okay, I see someone's writing, by the way, that Daniel is in Aramaic. So translation, like I said, doesn't always mean, right? You could have a translation of the Gemara into, I mean, the Gemara is actually Aramaic, but still you can translate things that are in Hebrew into Hebrew or translate things that are in English. Translation is an explanation. So that's, I think, the difference between, even though it is in Aramaic. So now they say, Targum Torah, Onkelos really said, V'ha Rav Ika bar Avin, Amar Rav Chanan el Amarav, or sorry, not said, but translated. My dichtiv vayikaru b'sefer Torah Elohim b'forash v'sum sechel v'yavinu b'mikra. This is a pasuk in Nehemiah. Now, again, get the time period. Onkelos was after the second temple was destroyed. Ezra and Nehemiah was in the time when they rebuilt the second temple. So talking about a difference of hundreds of years. So it says there, one of the things they did is they read from a Sefer Torah, the Torah of God explained, and they used their intelligence and they understood what was written. So what's the drasha in this pasuk? Vayikaru b'sefer Torah Elohim ze mikra. That's the psukim themselves. Miforash ze targum. They read the translation. Oh, what do you see here? There was already a translation. Okay, so there must have been a translation already from Ezra. That's already at the end of our question. We could stop right here, although we're going to continue the source till the end. But basically, how could Onkelos have done it hundreds of years later if it was already done before? V'sum sechel elu apsukim. That's where like the pasuk breaks are, the breaks in the verses. V'yavinu b'mikra elu piskei ta'amim. The ta'amei mikra, right, which give it the tune and where to stop and where to start, like punctuation. And v'amri la elu hamisarot. Some people say these are the traditions about, for example, what's when you have a vav or a yud and when you don't have a vav or a yud. Malay chaser. If you remember in the Gemara, there's all these drashot. Sometimes if there is a yud or there isn't a yud. So that's the misarot. In any case, what do you see here? That the translation existed hundreds of years before him. So what do you mean he translated the Torah? So again, the answer same as before. They forgot them. And then what Onkelos did was he reinstated the Targum that was forgotten from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So now the Gemara says, the question we were waiting for, why did the earth quake when translated the prophets, but not the Torah? Now you might disagree with this, but the Torah is very clear in what it means, even though we know that it's not exactly. But we'll try to explain what this means anyway. There's some things in the Nevi'im, some things are very clear, and some things are very unclear. And they're very ambiguous and could be, and I guess the point is they could be understood in many different ways. And for some reason, they claim that the Torah doesn't have this, even though it does, but there must be some sort of difference in terms of the lack of, the things that are open to interpretation. And here's a good example. Okay, they're going to bring an example of a pasuk that is totally incomprehensible without the translation of Yonatan ben Uziel. So, which again would make it seem like you would want a translation of that. But again, once you translate it, it's hard to understand it in any other way. And I think that that's really the danger of translations. It could be that there's other issues of the dangers of translation, right? In general, also, they didn't want to write things down. There was always a fear of all of that stuff in their generation. Could be, we also view things a little bit differently nowadays. So now let's see what it is. Dichtiv. Bayomahu yigdal mispeh b'Yerushalayim. On that day, the eulogies in Jerusalem are going to be so great, like the eulogies of Hadad Rimon in Bikat Megiddo. Okay, Hadad Rimon in Megiddo. Okay. What is Hadad Rimon in Megiddo? Nobody knows. It's totally unclear. What are they talking about? There's no Hadad Rimon in Megiddo, and you see they made it a little poetic. Hadad Rimon be Megiddon, okay, but it's really Megiddo. If I didn't have a Targum on this pasuk, I would have no idea what they're talking about. Now, here comes the Targum. Biyomahahu, on that day, Yiske mispeda di Yerushalayim. Okay, the mispeda, the eulogies in Jerusalem are going to be Kimispeda, or it's really the mourning will be Kimispeda da Achav bar Omri. All of a sudden, we're talking about Achav. Okay, it's like the hesped they did for Achav, the son of Omri. Remember, Achav kind of does tshuva at the end of his life and becomes a little good. And Dekatal Yate Hadad Rimon ben Tavrimon beRamot Gilad. I think in the Nevi'im he's called Ben Hadad, but Hadad Rimon can be similar. You say, it was Hadad Rimon ben Tavrimon that killed him in Ramot Gilad. He goes to war with Yehoshaphat, if you remember, and there was a whole thing with not asking the Navi. He asked his own. I'm not going to get into all the details of that story, but the point is he gets killed in this battle of Ramat Gilad against Ben Hadad. Remember, Paro Necho comes to battle Yoshiyahu. We had this story already in Masechet Ta'anit, where Paro Necho wants to go through the land for a different war, and he tries to pass through, and he's told, right, Yoshiyahu stops him and says, wait, it says no cherev is going to pass through here, even a cherev shel shalom. That's how it came up in Ta'anit. And even though he was passing for peaceful reasons, he darshan the pasuk in the wrong way and thought, he's not allowed, he must be, we have to fight against him. We can't allow this to happen. And Yoshiyahu was mistaken. He should have asked the Nevi'im and he didn't. He made his own decision and he gets killed. So that happened in Megiddo, that story. So basically what the Targum did was it said, it's not Hadad Rimon in Bikat Megiddo. It's two separate stories. And that's what it means. One is relating to Achav and one is Yoshiyahu. And that's what the pasuk is telling us. So without the Targum, I never would have understood that. And we don't have psukim apparently in the Torah that are so unclear like that. And that's the difference. Okay. That was the second thing that Rabbi Yirmiyah said in the name of Rabbi Chia bar Abba. I think here you see another connection, by the way, to the story of the Megillah. What is it? We were talking about Ezra and Nehemiah and all these things that were established in their time. The Nevi'im, the Psukim, and it's all about establishing Megillat Esther as, right, the Megillah, and Purim is the holiday. It's all about that same time period of going back to Israel, right, when in the the Galut, and then the going back and where things were established. It's kind of talking about things that happened in that time period that were set for generations. So I think it also connects with that idea. V'ra'iti ani Daniel levad et hamara. Okay, now we have another strange verse. Okay, there's a very strange verse. It actually reminds us of the story of Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, that Alana Kirshan spoke about at the Siyum, and we learned very well in Masechet Ta'anit where there's these voices, and only Rabbi Yochanan hears them, and Ilfa doesn't. So now we're going to talk about that in this section. So Daniel sees this vision. Okay, he sees something. But the people with me did not see it. But here's something weird happened. They got into a huge fear, a state of fear. The people who didn't see anything. Okay, obvious question. Why? If they didn't see anything, what were they fearful of? In the Yochanan and Ilfa story, Ilfa saw nothing. Here, they didn't see, but they somehow felt something. And they run away. Who are these people? So now we see why this is quoted here, because I'm a Rabbi Yirmiyah, V'item a Rabbi Chia bar Abba, our duo here. Either Rabbi Yirmiyah said this or Rabbi Chia bar Abba said it. Okay, who are these people that were with him? It was these three Nevi'im who are known to be the last of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. Again, talking about the same time period of the end of prophecy. Okay. Inu adif minei, v'iu adif minai. They're better than him, and he's better than them. In other words, each one has a certain advantage. Inu adif minei, inu nevi'eh, v'iu lav nevi'eh. They were prophets. Daniel was not a prophet. Iu adif minayu, but he was better than them. Iu chaza, v'inu lo chaza. He saw some vision, even though they were a Navi, they didn't see the vision that he saw. He saw it, they didn't. If they didn't see anything, what were they so scared about? Even though they didn't see, their mazal saw. What is their mazal? Rashi says everybody has like a sar, almost like a malach, an angel attached to them. Their angel saw it, and from there they sensed that something was wrong. So, right, it's almost like an inner voice, or sometimes you just feel something, you don't really know what it is. You're scared of something and you can't identify, or you're upset about something, you can't even figure out what you're upset about. So that's what I think the sugya is relating to. Ama Ravina, Shma Mina, Ravina says, one can infer from here. Hi man demibit, okay, here comes the Gemara with their hat of a psychologist on, right? The rabbi's telling you, here's some psychological some hints, okay, tips. Right? I always like to say the Gemara has everything in it, medical, psychological. Okay, here comes. If you're nervous or scared about something, even though you don't know what it is, your mazal knows what it is. Okay, there's some way to get to what it is. It's there. There's something there. Don't think, oh, this is nothing. There's really something there. So the obvious question, what can you do to fix it? Likrei kriyat shema. First answer is read Kriyat Shema, okay? Kind of like go to God, right? Affirm your belief in God. That will give you the strength to get through it. What if you're in a dirty place and you can't do that, right? Or what if it doesn't work? So, jump 4 amot away. In other words, go to a different place. Try to get, this is what we always say, perspective, right? Leave your situation and get perspective. Your dalet amot or your basic space. Leave your regular space, get perspective, and sometimes that will help. V'lo, and if not, lemahachi. Say the following, almost like an incantation, but you'll see that what it really means. There's a lot of other fat goats out there that are fatter than mine. In other words, go tell that thing that's bothering you, go bother somebody else, okay? Which is a way of kind of saying, I can do this. I can handle it, okay? And yet, go deal with, go bring your problems on somebody else. I don't need this in my life. But I think it's a way of, again, affirming your strength to be able to deal with it. It's like talk to yourself and talk yourself through it. So here are some ways of dealing with things that are, difficult and you're struggling with. This doesn't seem as much connected with the other things. But I think there was something I thought of. Let me just try to remember it, about this idea of, how did I connect it? 1 second. Right, this idea of taking things that seemed not to be, right, we have things that got lost along the way and they kind of brought them back, and things that people don't see. And this idea, I was thinking of God not appearing in the Megillah, and this idea of, things that aren't necessarily seen, but they're there, right? And this hidden, this haster astir panai, maybe that a little bit relates to this last thing. Okay, I can't remember the idea I developed before, but okay, maybe it'll come back to me. Okay, now we're going back to the very beginning, which was really the end of yesterday's stuff. Started with Medina, which came to say, right? Anyone who's close and anyone who sees. So since we darshan the words Medina, Ve'ir, Mishpacha, what do we do with the words Mishpacha in that pasuk? Why does it say in families and families? What do we need that for? We're now going to start a whole different sugya about what overrides what. If you're a Kohen or a Levi and you're working in the temple on that day, comes time, everyone's reading the Megillah, then you stop doing your avoda. Okay, the word is mivatzlim. It sounds like you're in the middle of doing the Korban Tamid, time for Megillah. You leave the temple and you go do you go read the Megillah. Mivatzlim sounds like you nullify it. You don't do the Korban that day. Now that's very strange. And Tosfot, the first Tosfot on the page says, Kasher. Why on earth would you can always do it. How long does Megillah take? Maybe it's a little bit long, but it doesn't take you all morning. Go back and finish the avoda after. And Tosfot says, of course, that's what it means. And when it says mivatzlim, it just means you push it off. Okay, sometimes pushing off, since it's the time for avoda, right? When you wake up in the morning and you push it off, that's considered mivatzlim. He says, obviously, it doesn't mean you don't do the korban at all. It just means that Megillah takes precedence in terms of the order. So now they say, and we're gonna. How do we know that it overrides? Megillah overrides the avoda, because it says Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav exactly this. Kohanim v'odatam Leviim b'duchanam. Right, that's what the Leviim stood on their steps. The Yisrael b'ma'amadam. We go back to what we talked about in Ta'anit about the ma'amadot, the Jews who were praying that the sacrifices be accepted. Kulam mevatlin avodatam ba'im l'shmo mikra Megillah. They all stop what they're doing to hear the Megillah. Now this is kind of radical because Megillah, again, this is establishing how important Megillah is, because Megillah was to Rabbanan, it's rabbinic, and yet it overrides Torah law. It's really fascinating, right? So that's what they're saying. Yes, it does, even though it's really strange. Mikan samchu shel Beit Rebbe. From here, the house of Beit Rebbe would do the following. Mevatzlim Talmud Torah b'im l'shmo mikra Megillah. They would also stop the yeshiva, stop learning in order to read the Megillah. Kavachomer me'avodah. He made it very simple, although we'll see maybe not so simple. Kavachomer, he said like this: Ma'avodah shi chamura. Avodah in the temple is obviously more serious than Talmud Torah, so therefore he chamura, and yet mivatzlin, and yet we stop it to read the Megillah. Talmud Torah lo koshken, all the more so Talmud Torah. So avodah chamura mi Talmud Torah. I said, what? Who says avodah is more severe than Talmud Torah? More serious? Come on, right? Is it? What would you think? You probably think it is, but we're going to bring you a story that's going to show that it's not. The Talmud Torah is more serious than avodah. V'haktiv, v'yibiyot Yoshua b'Yericho. Okay, when Yoshua was in Yericho, famous battle. V'yisan, very famous story. V'yisayin avayar v'hinei ish omed lenegdo. There's a person there. V'yishtachu, and he bows down to him. Okay, it's this angel. He comes and he says, "I'm Sartzva Hashem. I'm the angel of war of gods. Okay, I'm his, what do you say, chief of staff or something, for battle." So the Gemara asks, "Hey, first of all, how did he bow to him?" Okay, we talked about evil spirits before or bad thoughts. Now we're going to see another thing about this. You're not allowed to say hello even, forget about bowing, to your friend at night. At night, there were evil spirits floating, and maybe what you think is your friend really is an evil spirit. So how did he bow down to this figure he sees at night? Could have been an evil spirit. So, right, this is like a good riddle. See someone, how do you know if they're an evil spirit or not? So, he said to him, I am the Sartzva, the officer of the army of God, the head of the army of God. So, right, this is why I thought it was like a joke. You have two people and one's lying, one's not lying. How do you know who's lying, who's telling the truth? One of those riddles. So Dilma Mashakre, maybe he was lying. That's an evil spirit trying to dress up and pretend, right, would say, it would be a perfect thing to say. And then he'd trick him. No, we have a rule. Even evil spirits don't use God's name in vain. So if he says God's name, he must have been representing God. Okay, well, how we know this is a good question. I'm going to leave that issue aside. So now, what did the Sartz of Hashem say to him? What did this person say? Amar Emesh, yesterday, Bitaltum Talmid Ben Arbaim. I'm not going to get into all the details when they didn't do the Korban of the Ben Arbaim, how we know this. Okay, they were maybe busy with war. Unclear exactly. The commentaries all have different interpretations. Ve'achshav Bitaltum Talmud Torah. Now, right, you're busy getting ready for war, and you didn't learn Torah. So because of that, I'm here. Amar lo, al eza mehem bata. He said, but really, for which one did you come? Okay, for the fact that we didn't do the Korban or the fact that we didn't learn? So Amar lo, and this is from the verse, ata bati. What they're darshaning here is the verse, now I came. Why did now I come? If it was so important that you didn't do the sacrifice, I would have come yesterday. But I came now because of the Talmud Torah. So what do you see? Right? That it was the Torah that was more important than not doing the temple sacrifices. The continuation is, and here they know how it is that the issue is Talmud Torah, because it doesn't say that in the pasuk at all. But the next verse is, Vayalin Yoshua balaylahu b'toch ha'emek. He slept in the valley. Why do they tell you this? Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now, you might have thought, right, going to sleep is like avoiding things, right? But no. This was his response. What is Vayalin Melamed, and why ba'emek? Shelan ba'omka shel halacha. He slept in the depths of halacha. In other words, he learned that whole night. He didn't really go to sleep. He went to sleep learning, okay? He made sure to learn to make up for the fact that they hadn't learned before. That's where they get that. It's a drasha, obviously, that what they hadn't done was Talmud Torah. So what do you see here? V'amar Shmuel bar Unya, gadol Talmud Torah yoter mehakavat midin, shene'emar ata bati. Because he says, now I came, and he didn't come after they didn't do the sacrifice, it must be. Talmud Torah is more strict than the sacrifices. So the whole theory of what we saw before, the house of Rebbe, that they would stop learning in order to go hear the Megillah, because if you stop the avoda, of course you're going to stop learning, is really doesn't fit with this source. So they answer lo kasha. It's really not a difficulty. Hadi rabim, hadi yachid. In the time of Yoshua, what was it? It was the whole nation. He basically prevented everybody from learning Torah. Again, this is the rabbis taking their world that everybody learns Torah, or that was the ideal anyway, and supplanting it on the generation that was going in. You always think of those people as warriors more so than Talmud scholars. But here they basically, as if they were learning Torah, and what they didn't do that day, they were so busy they weren't learning Torah. So now they say he stopped many people from learning Torah. That is a problem. Many people is more important. But hadi achid, here we're talking about an individual. An individual, if you have a choice, learn Torah or read Megillah, you should choose to read the Megillah. So now the Gemara says, wait, udi achid kal, you think one individual's Talmud Torah is not so strict? The hatnan, right, not so important, but hatnan, and now really off topic, and you're going to see the comparison's not exactly a fair comparison. It's not a real good comparison, and the Gemara is going to say that eventually. So don't worry if, as I read this, say well, this is comparing apples and oranges, really. But what they want to say is in individuals, Talmud Torah is very important, and we're going to translate that a little bit differently as we go on. But now we're quoting a Mishnah, which says in Mishnah Moed Katam, we're going to get to that soon, next Masechet, Nashim b'moed ma'anot avalo mitapchot. Okay, women on Chol HaMoed, okay, this was women were the eulogizers. They would do eulogies, they would sing, they would like make these keynote mekonenot, they would do these cries, okay, one would cry and then all of them would answer. And then also mitapchot, they would kind of hit their hearts like we do in Slach Lanu, I think something like that. So those are three terms you have to know. Ma'anot is the eulogies, mitapchot is to hit their chests, and mekonenot is the singing. So now, the nashim on Chol HaMoed, me'anot aval lo mitapchot. When it's Chol HaMoed, we have to limit, right? We don't want to do it as like it was then, right? You know, it's a day of happiness. We don't want to do it in its full eulogies. So what do? They can do eulogies, but lo mitapchot. They don't pound on their chest. Rabbi Yishmael omer, im hayu smuchot lamita mitapchot. If they're right next to the dead body, then they can. When it's Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah, and Purim, when it's not as much Chol HaMoed, that's less important. Then they can both eulogize and hit their chests. We're very off topic here. We'll get back in a minute. Okay, but in both this and that, meaning Chol HaMoed and Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah, Purim, lo mekoneno. They definitely don't do the crying, right? Those cries you hear. Sometimes you go to funerals, they still do that. The Amar Rabba Bar Huna, ein moed b'fnei talmid chacham, v'koshken Chanukah u'Purim. He says the issue of Chol HaMoed doesn't apply when a talmid chacham dies. So if a talmid chacham dies, you do all this. The whole halach is out the window on Chol HaMoed. And then the Gemara says, and obviously then on Chanukah Purim, which basically means Talmud Torah is more important than Purim, because here Talmid Chacham dies and he represents. Here's where the comparison is not so equal. He's a representative of Torah, right? It's not an issue of is somebody learning or not learning, or we canceling learning. That's what we're going to say. This isn't really a fair comparison, but let's just assume right now it is. A Talmid Chacham dies, we override the laws of Purim. You can do anything. So, right, you override the happiness of Purim. So the Gemara answers and says, Kvod Torah ka'amart, Kvod Torah d'yachid chamor, Talmud Torah d'yachid kal. When it comes to the respect of Torah, the kavod of Torah of a Talmid Chacham, this is now I get where I wanted to connect. Here's my connection that I was struggling with before. It comes from here. A kavod of a what is a Talmid Chacham? He's a representative of God in this world. That's the way we always view him, which is why Talmid Chacham, if he wants to be mochel on his kavod, he's not allowed to. If he says, oh, don't stand up for me, he really can't do that because he's a representative of God. And that's basically a slap in the face to God. So that's not the same as a Talmud Torah v'yachid. An individual who is learning, if Mikra Megillah comes up, he drops his learning, goes to Mikra Megillah. Those are two very different things. One has to do with respect of a Talmid Chacham, and one has to do with learning Torah. So what I wanted to say here, what I was thinking about is that this issue of God being not present in the Megillah, right? How you don't have the word God in the Megillah at all, and it's kind of implied in all sorts of places and comes up. There's representatives of God all throughout the Megillah. Here also, it's the same idea of a Talmid Chacham is a representative of God, and I thought it connected very well with the idea of Ta'anit. Right? All throughout Ta'anit, we're looking for signs of God when there's no more Nevi'im. And that's why I think it starts with the Nevi'im, the Sugya, right? And it talks about the prophets who are still connected with God. We keep making these connections. So when he learned it from Chagai Zechariah Malachi, we're trying to connect back to the prophecy and the time when we had direct connection with God. And in Ta'anit, we were looking for God through the rain. Here we're looking through God. We're looking for God either through the Talmidei Chachamim, they're our connection, they're our representative when there's no more prophecy. And because remember, they're living in the generation, right? It's already, prophecy's been gone for a while, but now they don't even have a temple. They're searching for ways to find God. And the Megillah is another way to find God, right? To find God in miracles. Now, we don't have miracles anymore so much either. So we have to find it in other ways, which are through the Talmidei Chachamim of our generation. So I think these ideas or concepts that connect both back with the previous Masechet and with the concept of Purim in general. And also in a time, like we said, Megillah Ta'anit, where they were canceling all these other days, this day remained, and the idea was to keep it as this connection. Okay, moving on. Amarav. We're still talking about now this hierarchy. What comes before what? So we're going to take it even farther. Pshitali, it's obvious based on what we said, and we'll see in a second, they're going to say it because we said this already. Avodah mikra Megillah, if you have these two on a balancing scale, right? What's more important, Korbanot or Megillah? We already said Mikra Megillah Adif. Go read the Megillah. Mid Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, because he said it. And if you have Talmud Torah, Mikra Megillah Adif, Midasam Plushal Beit Rebbe. So we saw in Beit Rebbe, this is what they did. They chose to read Megillah and not learn Torah. But Talmud Torah, Umeit mitzvah. What about learning Torah and a meit mitzvah? Meit mitzvah is a huge mitzvah. It's when somebody dies and there's no one to bury. So if there's no one to bury this person and you're busy learning in the Beit Midrash, get up from the Beit Midrash. Meit mitzvah overrides that. How do we know this? Miditanya, from it says in the Braita, Mivatzlim Talmud Torah lahotzaat hamet ulachnasat kala. You get up from the Beit Midrash if you need to bury someone or even for a wedding. Avodah umeit mitzvah. What about you're in the temple and then there's a meit mitzvah and nobody's dealing with it? Meit mitzvah adif. It also comes first, takes precedence. Mi villa achoto. Here's a bit of a strange drasha. It's a word that appears by the Nazir. The Nazir is not allowed to become tamei to anybody. It says that. Don't become tamei to anyone. Then it says, don't become tamei to your mother, your father, your mother, your brother, your sister. It already said, don't become tamei to anyone. So why do you have to specify all these people? So there's a slew of drashot on each word, what it's coming to include. So when we get to the word lachoto, the Gemara goes off and says, we don't need to teach you this about the Nazir. So it must be, this is what we call an imei no inyan. If it's not about a Nazir, it must be about something else. So what does lachoto teach you? What does it teach you? You're on your way to do a sacrifice, to slaughter the korban pesach, or to give your son a brit milah. And all of a sudden you have a relative who died. Again, we're not talking about a Nazir, according to most interpretations. Some try to explain it has to do with a Nazir, but let's just assume we're talking about a regular person. Here's someone died in his family or her family. Yachol yitama. Amar lo yitama, but it says lachoto lo yitama. It says, no, you don't. Yachol kashem sheino metamei lachoto kachino metamei lemeit mitzvah. So you might have thought you can't even be metamei to your sister if you're on your way to do a korban, because korban is more important. But what if it was a meit mitzvah? Maybe also not, just like villa achoto. So therefore it says, Talmud Lomar villa achoto. It comes to tell you, not your sister, but yes, if it's a meit mitzvah. Okay, lachoto deino metamei ava metamei lemeit mitzvah. So that teaches you, meit mitzvah overrides even avoda. So now they say, by Rava asked the following question. Mikra Megillah umeit mitzvah heminayu adif. If you're reading the Megillah, or you have a meit mitzvah, which comes first? Okay, because remember, Megillah had precedence over all those things. So now we have the two highest things. Mikra Megillah adif mishum pirsumei nisa, maybe because you have to be mefarsim the nes, it's more important. Oh, right, you have to publicize the miracle. Oh, Dilma meit mitzvah adif mishum kvod ha'briyot. Maybe meit mitzvah is more important because of respect of human beings, basic human respect. Batar debaya hadar pashta. After he asked the question, he actually figured out the answer himself. Meit mitzvah adif da'amal gadol kvod ha'briyot shedochet lo taseh shebatorah. Meit mitzvah overrides even a negative commandment. And so far, Mikra Megillah just overrode positive things. Avoda, Talmud Torah. This overrides even negative. The commentators try to figure out where that is. So one of the famous ones is if you're a Talmid Chacham and it's not respectful for you to pick up some lost item, if it's in a way that's just not respectable, whatever it might be, you don't have to do that. Even though it says lo tuchal litalem, you can't ignore it. If you find a lost item, you have to deal with it. But it says no. If it's not lefi chodcha, then you don't have to, because kavod habriyot is dochel lo taseh shebatorah. If it's not lefi akavod, whatever it is, you have to do. Okay, next. Gufa. We're now going back to the statement we made at the end of yesterday's stuff. Samuch v'nireh. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, "Kach v'chol samuch lo v'chol nireh moni don't kikach." So now there's a braita about this. Anyone close and anyone who can see. Samuch afal pi she'eino nireh, nireh afal pi she'eino samuch. You could have close and you don't see, and you could see, but it's not close. Bishlama nireh afal pi she'eino samuch. That we understand. You could see but not be close. What would the case be? If you're at the top of a mountain, you'd be able to see even though you're very far away. But what could be close that you can't see? If you're close, obviously you can see. If you're in the opposite, you're in the valley, right? You're in a stream that's very low and the city's higher up and you can't see, your view is blocked. Either of those cases, you're going to do it like the big walled city. Now we're going to have a slew of laws of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi about krachim. Krachim are walled cities. The first one is going to be not about Megillah. It's about a halacha that comes up in the Torah. We're not going to go into all the details, but in Sefer Vayikra, there's all these laws of when you sell property. In those days, you basically sold property because you had no money, and we allow you to buy it back, okay? But if it's in a walled city, you can only buy it back within the first year, and it doesn't revert back to being yours in the Yovel year. It's different in walled cities and not walled cities. So Amar B'Shoban Levi, Krach she'yashavu levasof ukaf. What if it's in a place that was inhabited, a city that was inhabited, and only later did they put up a wall? Nidon kikfal. It's basically treated like an unwalled city for these laws. My time, dichtiv. V'ishkim kor beit moshav ir choma. If you sell a house, when it talks about the selling, in a moshav beit choma, in an inhabited city that had a wall. So basically it means it must have been an inhabited city that had a wall from the beginning. It had to be, it started as a wall, then got settled as opposed to the reverse. That has nothing to do with Megillah. Okay, now he's going to say some things that have to do with Megillah. 2 more laws, and then tomorrow we'll see the rest on tomorrow's daf. If it's a big city, but it doesn't even have 10 people, but Lanim, there's all different interpretations. We'll go with Rashi, who says it's 10 people who sit basically all day in the Beit HaKnesset, in the shul. They're always there, almost like there's always an option of a minyan there. If it's less than it doesn't have that, then even if it's a big city, it's like a small village. Okay, and that goes back to all the laws in the Mishnah. So the Gemara asks, "My kamashmalam, what is Rabbi Shoban Levi teaching us? He's an Emora, and in Tanina it already says that in the Mishnah. We'll see it on Daf Hey. Ezu Iyur Gdola. What is an Iyur Gdola? Kol sheyesh ba 10 bat lanim. That's called a big city. Pachot mikan. If it doesn't have a 10 bat lanim, arei ze kfal. So we basically said that exactly. So krach itzri chale. He had to say it. Af agav de miklalei ma'alma. Has to be natives to the city. It can't be. It could be a big city. The people came from all different places, and right now there happens to be 10 people because they came from other places that are sitting in the Beit Knesset. That doesn't count. It has to be inhabitants of the city. That was his chiddush. Last halacha of Rabbi Shoban Levi for today. Amar Rabbi Shoban Levi, Kach shecharavu lebasof yashav. If it was destroyed and then got rebuilt, nidon kikrach. It's like a walled city. So what does it mean, destroyed and then rebuilt? My charav ilema charvu chomotav. The walls fell down, and then what did it say? Ulevasof yashav. Only if you rebuild the walls is it a walled city. Yashav im, but if you didn't rebuild the walls, lo yashav, it wouldn't be. That can't possibly be because v'hatanya. Rabbi Eliezer bar Yossi Omer, again quoting from the verses in Vayikra about the era of the walled cities. Asher lo choma. There's a very weird lo. Lo can be written as lamed vav, which means it has lo choma would be it has a wall, and lo with an aleph is lo choma, there is no wall. So what is this lo with a vav and lo with an aleph? Right? It has all 3 letters, the lamed vav aleph. It's a drasha. It's there for drasha. Even if it doesn't have a wall now, as in lo with an aleph, lo choma, it had before, it's treated like a walled city. So here you see it doesn't have to be rebuilt, the wall. And as if it had a wall from the times of Yoshua ben Nun, it's like a walled city. So ela my charav. So what must that be? Shecharav me 10 bat lanim. It means it no longer has a 10 bat lanim. The city once had a 10 bat lanim. Now it doesn't anymore have a 10 bat lanim. Only when we have a 10 bat lanim again do we treat it like a big city. Otherwise, it's not treated like a big city. That was his next halacha, and we're going to see all sorts of other halachot that he says on tomorrow's daf as well. Have a good day, everybody.